Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar series featuring international speakers. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Yeling Tan from the University of Oregon to present to us her latest book, Disaggregating China Inc. State Strategies in a Liberal Economic Order. So Yeling is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Oregon and a non-resident scholar at the UC San Diego 21st Century China Center. She is also a public intellectual fellow with the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Her research interest lies at the intersection of international and comparative political economy with an emphasis on China and the developing world. We also have a wonderful discussant today, being John Liu, my colleague at the University of Hong Kong Department of Law. So John's research interests include courts and judicial behavior, as well as law and development. And his work draws in methods of data sciences and economics, and he's very good at taking advantage of large data sets of judicial opinions in China to analyze and predict judges' behavior. So without further ado, let me first invite Yeling to give us a talk on her latest book, a super exciting new book everybody's been talking about. And then we will give some time for John to give his comments and before opening up for Q&A. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Angela, and thank you, John, both for being here and for the very kind invitation to speak. It's a real honor to be able to participate in your international speaker series. So let me quickly share my slides. Can everybody see that? Yes, perfect. So I am going to start my discussion of the book actually by bringing our audience 20 years back into recent history when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. You see from the slide there, this very jubilant mood of the participants, both in China and around the world. And that really signified the very high expectations during this moment that entry into the World Trade Organization would usher in a new era of liberalization in the Chinese economy. And there were very high hopes that through a common set of international rules and through mutually beneficial economic exchange, WTO entry would peacefully integrate a rising China into the international order. Back then, American President Bill Clinton, when he was putting his case forward to the American public for China's WTO entry and assimilation into this international system, argued that under the WTO, some of China's most important decisions for the first time will be subject to the review of international bodies with rules and binding dispute settlement. Then Treasury Secretary Larry Summers made a very similar case in his public remarks, saying that by learning to play by the rules, by the rule of law, China will strengthen the rule of law, which will enable it to become a more reliable partner and a fair society. Now, you might ask why expectations were so high around China's WTO entry. Now, this was in part due to the strength and depth of China's commitments to the WTO. As part of its protocol of accession, the first page of which you see on the screen there, China promised to let the market rather than the state set prices for most goods in the economy. It committed to liberalizing the trading rights to all firms, so no longer only letting state-owned enterprises have the right to trade. They committed to improving the disclosure of information around economic policies, to not intervening in the operation of the market, to not discriminating between domestic and foreign firms, to set up institutions that would enable the independent regulation of the market, to strengthen the rule of law broadly in economic governance. In short, commitments that amounted to no less than a Herculean effort that would transform China's economy from one that was very much rooted in state planning to one that would operate much more on market forces. Now we fast forward to today, and this liberal internationalist promise of integration appears to have been replaced by disappointment and by discontent. In 2018, the Trump administration declared that it was a mistake to have allowed China into the WTO. And layered on top of that, we have in recent years the number of dispute cases against China at the WTO multiplying, steadily increasing. China has also clashed with both the European Union and the United States over its status as a non-market economy in trade remedy cases at the WTO. Both the United States and the European Union have shifted their postures to treating China now as a quote unquote strategic competitor. Sanctions on companies such as Huawei and ZTE, as well as a trade war that sees no end, have raised very broad fears around the world that the two countries are headed towards a decoupling of the two largest economies of the world are headed towards this very dangerous and potentially disruptive decoupling. Now, importantly, this discontent with China is bipartisan. So these economic tensions that I've been describing have continued into the Biden administration. Both the United States Trade Representative and the Commerce Secretary are sticking to the use of tariffs. There's a new Section 301 investigation. So this is really bipartisan and quite consistent across both parties and both major parties in the United States. And so where we are today is that in contrast to the integrationist expectations that I began this talk with from 2 decades ago, a new conventional wisdom appears to have formed around China and the global trading system. They are firstly that the WTO has failed to alter China's economic model. Secondly, that China is instead building a state capitalist model. And third, that this model is being exported globally through state-owned enterprises and Chinese state industrial policy. Now, in my talk today, I'm going to try to question much of this conventional wisdom. In particular, my argument pushes against categorizing Chinese behavior into binary categories. Now, why is this important? I think there are real limits to thinking about China's WTO experience in terms of either a success or a failure, this dichotomous categories, because it overlooks important questions of when liberalizing reforms did take place and why. It also disregards really important puzzles about the specific timing of when these reforms slowed down and why. More importantly, in the political science discipline that I'm based in, the literature also has this tendency of categorizing state responses into global rules into these binaries, either protection versus liberalization, compliance versus defiance. And these types of dichotomous frameworks tend to impose binaries on state behavior when in fact choices available to states are actually quite wide-ranging. States can choose from a great variety of policy instruments when they consider how to respond to international trading rules. So instead, I argue that we have to consider how responses to these global rules are actually mediated by state structure and mediated by politics within the state. So why do we care about politics within the state? In part, this is because the main burden of adjustment to WTO entry fell on China's massive state apparatus. So quoting here from a interview that was published with a Central Party school official, right? He said, WTO entry is a strategic move for our country's economic development, but also brings about a problem, which is how the party in its decision and policymaking process can defend China's national interest and socialist principles while fulfilling international norms and WTO rules. And he went on to say, the biggest shock of the WTO to China is aimed at our government, and we're a government governed by a single party. So in reality, the ones who will feel the shock will be the party's administrative and leadership methods. Now, one might argue that, well, with single party rule in China, then we mainly need to focus on what the leadership says and their policy directions to figure out how China adapted to and responded to WTO entry. But the direction that my book takes is to really focus on the bureaucracy and other political actors within the state, rather than just the leadership, because the bureaucracy can often make things either easy or hard for the leadership. So quoting here, right, from Deng himself, right, who said once a political line is established, someone must implement it. And depending on who is in charge of implementation, those who support the party line, those who do not, those who take the middle of the road position, the results will be different. So the book really delves into the WTO's impact on politics within the state, within the bureaucracy in China. So my book, therefore, is structured around two main research questions. First, what is the range of strategies that Chinese state actors can adopt to engage with WTO rules? Secondly, why did some parts of the Chinese state adopt more liberalizing reforms than others in response to WTO entry? So beginning with this first question on the range of strategies, so to set the stage for this, we have to begin with China's history of reform and opening, which was very much a non-linear process involving a lot of policy experimentation and an incremental approach to liberalizing the economy, as a lot of literature, a lot of very excellent literature has already documented. So new policies were created around the planned economy rather than replacing it. New agencies were also created to lead reforms alongside old ones. And the result of this layered approach to change is that older mindsets and policies remained in the governing system, such that even as China's economy took off, there really wasn't necessarily an agreement within the party state over this really important question of how to govern the economy. And broadly, I therefore try to characterize these disagreements as coalescing around three different competing modes of economic governance, or what I call state strategies. The first is what I call a directive strategy, which we can think of as being market substituting in nature, relying on administrative guidance and the state allocation of resources, very much rooted in China's command economy in the past. So one example would be setting production targets for firms rather than letting the market drive production outcomes. You just set the production targets ahead of time, basically substituting for what the market would otherwise be operating to produce outcomes in the economy. Second is what I call a developmental strategy, which is market shaping in nature. Now, this strategy relies on the use of state incentives to attract firm activity from one sector to another more preferred sector. So an example here would be using tax breaks to draw firms towards, for example, high-tech sectors, semiconductors, automotive, and so on. And the third is what I call a regulatory strategy, which we can think of as being market enhancing in nature. Here, what the state is, the state functions to set and enforce rules really aimed at boosting the functioning of the market. So one example would be setting standards that therefore enhance interoperability within the economy. And here, then market outcomes are going to depend on firms competing with each other within these rules, rather than being drawn to state incentives or rather than responding to production targets and so on. Now, when we have these three competing modes of economic governance, we then have to consider how they operate within China's internal state structure. And so here we really have to consider how these competing modes of governance are actually even further exacerbated by China's political structure, which has been very commonly described by political scientists in terms of fragmented authoritarianism, where multiple sub-state actors have the ability and the authority to influence economic policy. So here we're not just looking at the political leadership, we're also looking at central economic agencies, we're looking at subnational, provincial and local governments. And even within China's authoritarian structure, we see that the incentives of these various actors are often misaligned or even opposed to each other. And this means that China's economic development is often the product of this internal political contestation rather than the result of a coordinated master plan. Now, when we bring this reasoning into thinking about globalization and world WTO entry, we have to think about how the effects of globalization are actually mediated by this fragmented state structure. So having set the scene and laying out these range of strategies, I'd like to turn now to the main question of the book, right? To examine why some parts of the Chinese state structure adopted more liberalizing reforms than others in response to WTO entry. And here I really divide up the book into examining a series of dynamics playing out across different parts of China's really vast and complex state structure. So first, I look at how the China's policy trajectories in the WTO period varied across China's hierarchical state. And then I turn to unpacking the political responses within China's very powerful central government to explain the rise of Chinese state capitalism. And third, finally, looking across strategic industries to examine how WTO entry affected China's quest to build national champions. So this is a rather multidimensional analysis, but the theory I propose to explain the overall trajectories, policy trajectories, is fairly simple. So I propose that WTO entry introduces two sets of new conditions that actors within the state then have to respond to. The first is open competition brought about by economic liberalization, so the lowering of tariffs and the opening up of the market. The second is a new set of bureaucratic rules stemming from the WTO, stipulating how the state should govern the economy. And these combined conditions have a profound impact in shifting the incentives of actors within the Chinese state. And I propose that the ways in which these various bureaucratic actors respond to these new conditions basically depend very broadly on, firstly, the probability of being sanctioned, and secondly, their prospects for advancement within the political system. So using this very simple cost-benefit framework, I then show that the specific channels for sanction and advancement actually vary depending on where an actor sits within China's state structure, to then affect whether the policy responses are directive or developmental or regulatory. Now, a quick note on methodology. Now, in order to capture the use of these different state strategies over time and across different parts of the state, what I did was I collected an original data set of laws and regulations containing that were issued by different arms of central governments, of national governments, across a number of manufacturing sectors from the reform period onwards till 2014, putting together which comprised a document corpus of various industrial policies, decisions, regulations, guidances, and so on. Which basically contains what we can think of as the ordinary language of China's economic bureaucracy. I then use machine learning methods to try to uncover the topics that are latent in these documents, to try to identify the changing prevalence of what is directive language versus developmental language versus regulatory language. and then combine this data and analysis with evidence from interviews, speeches, and so on. So with that very short methodological note, I'll spend the rest of the talk just giving everyone an overview of the main findings of the book, beginning first with the hierarchical politics of WTO entry. So my argument is that firstly, how the central and subnational governments responded to WTO entry depends firstly on how accountable each authority is to the WTO. And secondly, on whether the industrial diversity of each unit meant that WTO entry either increased export opportunities or actually raised the threat of import competition. What I find, first of all, is that the central government responded to WTO entry with really an increase in market enhancing, liberalizing policies. So this figure that you see on the slide before you shows the results of the machine learning textual analysis that I described earlier. And the solid line shows the prevalence of liberalizing language and policies issued by the central government. The dashed line shows the prevalence of liberalizing language from the provincial governments, and the dotted line for the same thing for the local government. And then you see the vertical line there indicating 2001, which is WTO entry. And what you see is that prior to WTO entry, there's no real trend that distinguishes the liberalizing language content across the three levels of government. After WTO entry, we see this stark divergence. There's this big increase in market enhancing language in the central government's policies, much more so than the two lower level subnational governments. And I argue that much of this liberalizing response was driven by the central government's very high degree of accountability to the WTO. So because unlike provinces, unlike counties and prefectures, Beijing plays this role of sovereign representative of China at the WTO. So it has to account for its policies to the other WTO member governments. So in the years immediately following WTO entry, what we see is the central government engaging in a legislative overhaul to strengthen market institutions in China, to reform numerous types of laws, to review over 20,000 technical standards to bring China into conformity with WTO rules, and even launching a national campaign to raise WTO awareness, both in the bureaucracy and in the broader public. Now that's the central government. The responses from subnational governments were very different, as I'll show you in these two figures. So this figure shows us that provincial governments really increased their developmental language in their policies. Local governments strengthened their directive policies. So what's going on to drive these very different types of responses from subnational governments? Well, I argue that this is because subnational governments, on the one hand, they're shielded from the direct accountability to WTO rules, right? So the city of Ningbo, if it enacts a WTO inconsistent policy, hypothetically speaking, right, it's not going to be held directly to account in Geneva at the WTO. On the other hand, the subnational leaders of these subnational cities and so on are directly exposed to the economic effects of foreign competition brought about by WTO entry. And this is going to affect their ability to spur growth in their jurisdictions. So those who found that they could compete to expand their exports, right, could be seen issuing industrial policies to spur exports in strategic industries such as automotives. Those who are not as competitive as many of China's smaller prefectures, and especially those in the rural inland areas that didn't have as rich of an industrial mix, instead had to issue more directive policies to kind of forcibly restructure their industries, to consolidate and get rid of uncompetitive firms in order to boost their competitiveness. What we see, therefore, is that there wasn't a monolithic response to WTO entry. While WTO entry did trigger these initial sweeping efforts to institute market enhancing policies, these were by and large led by the central government. Subnational governments actually adopted very contradictory strategies. And that led to this very stark internal divergence in China's WTO era policy trajectories. So that's the hierarchical dynamics of WTO entry. The next chapter of the book turns to politics within China's very powerful central government to explain the rise of what's come to be called state capitalism. So while the central government responded to WTO entry with this initial surge, as I just described, of market enhancing reform, this momentum lost steam over time. Instead, analysts started to point to the phenomenon of 国进民退, so the state advances while the private sector retreats, as central policies began to take on more developmental tones. So then this chapter tries to explain the shift and to explain the timing of the shift in the central government's policies. Now, the dominant explanations that one tends to see around this question would be firstly that it was the 2008 financial crisis that sparked the shift, or secondly, that it was new leaderships in the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao leadership era. In the book, I discuss why both of these explanations are fairly inadequate. As I'll show shortly, this turn towards state capitalism actually preceded the financial crisis. And when it comes to explanations focused on leadership preferences, there are some shortcomings there as well, because it assumes that the bureaucracy always acts as faithful agents at all points in time and kind of overemphasizes the ideological differences between different sets of leaders. And more importantly, it doesn't actually explain the pattern of the policy shift. My argument is that the shift was driven by a combination of both domestic and international factors. So domestically, we have to consider accountability relations between the party leadership and the central government. And internationally, we have to consider the degree to which technocratic agencies within Beijing could use WTO rules as external leverage to drive domestic reform. And what I find is that during the Jiang Zemin Zhu Rongji era, the leadership could effectively deploy the central bureaucracy as a faithful agent, such that those years were marked by very important disciplining reforms, such as the SOE campaign to consolidate SOEs and get rid of inefficient state firms. Another example would be the administrative restructuring in 1998 that led to very massive cuts in the number of ministries and number of civil servants, as well as WTO itself, WTO entry itself, which was actually quite fiercely resisted by different parts of the bureaucracy. At the same time, the initial post-entry years were marked by very strong leverage. External WTO leverage. And in fact, it was this external leverage that enabled Premier Zhu to push for WTO entry. And China had also committed to a very clear timetable for implementing many of its WTO commitments, such that after accession, technocratic agencies within China could use this timetable as leverage to keep the reform effort going. Now, as the years passed, however, both of these two variables started to shift. Both party state accountability and WTO leverage shifted. The leadership in the leadership era of Hu and Wen was different from Jiang and Zhu in the sense that these new leaders very much relied on the central state as a key constituency. And as a result, those years were marked by an expansion of the Beijing bureaucracy's influence, and in particular, the expansion and the rise of very powerful industrial policy agencies, such as the National Development and Reform Commission. After the 2008 restructuring, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, and of course, SASAC overseeing SOE assets. At the same time, WTO leverage started to shift as well. It started to decline because many of the commitments in China's protocol of accession were fulfilled. This led to a loss of momentum within the bureaucracy, and some of the international obligations that China had signed on to started to be ignored. And at the same time, there was this accumulation of opposition to reform. For example, some of China's negotiators were even accused during the time of negotiations of having sold out the country. And these various forces, right, the decline in WTO leverage meant that it was the industrial policy agencies that gained influence, while the more technocratic agencies lost ground in relative terms. Now we see this shift in a number of very important policy changes that started to emerge around 2005 and so on, including the 11th Five-Year Plan focused on indigenous innovation, the medium to long-term plan for science and technology, announcements reinforcing the role of SOEs in China's key industries, regulations giving procurement priority to Chinese-made products, and so on. Now, many of these policies actually had an impact on the overall business environment and were met with negative reactions by the foreign business community. So this figure that you see on the chart shows us the changes in business sentiments in the American Chamber of Commerce's annual survey of its firms that are based in China. And what we see is that in the initial years after WTO entry, there's a very large majority of firms saying that they have benefited either to a great extent or to a very great extent from Chinese economic reforms. And this number actually falls rather dramatically from 2005, 2006 onwards. And these sentiments are even more negative in those years prior to the onset of the financial crisis in 2008, so in 2008, 2009. So counter to popular perceptions, the rise of Chinese state capitalism actually predated the financial crisis. This is not to say that the financial crisis was not important. It was very important. But what it did do was basically to really deepen a shift that it was already occurring towards more developmental forms of statism. Now, more importantly, the shift in trajectory was not necessarily the result of this coordinated China incorporated master plan, but the product of a shift both in party-state relations, as well as the loss of external WTO leverage that affected the relative influence of different agencies within the bureaucracy. So then the next chapter of the book turns to consider what the implications are then for Chinese industrial policy in the WTO age. So this final chapter turns to look at the quest for national champions. So here, the question that is posed is, did this turn towards state capitalism therefore bring about a more coherent industrial policy? And I argue that rather than bringing about more coherence in the industrial policy, right, WTO entry actually generated greater policy conflict between central and subnational governments, and that this tension, this conflict was actually exacerbated through an FDI channel, through the foreign direct investment that was started to surge into China after WTO entry. I focus on FDI because while both central and subnational governments seek to attract FDI, each actually deploys foreign investment towards different political purposes, and that's going to lead to policy conflict. So the key variables that matter here are firstly, who holds the contracting authority for FDI? And secondly, what's the goal of FDI? Is the actor trying to maximize capital, or is it trying to maximize technology? Now, the goal of FDI matters because growth serves different political purposes for different state actors. For the central government, in stylized terms, right, we can think of it as seeking economic growth for regime promotion purposes, right, to strengthen the Chinese system through access to foreign technology, so as to boost industrial upgrading. And subnational governments, in contrast, seek economic growth for more short-term rank promotion purposes. Here, WTO entry represents opportunities for short-term growth by maximizing the capital component of FDI rather than the technology component of FDI. So it's going to matter whether the contracting authority is centralized or delegated to subnational governments, because it affects whether it's the technology or the capital component of FDI that's being privileged when that FDI enters China. So the book explores these dynamics in two comparative case studies, the automotive industry and the semiconductor industry. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus just and give a little bit of an overview just on the semiconductor case study. So FDI for semiconductors initially very much resembled that for the automotive industry, in that there was a joint venture rule in place. But in the 2000s, there was a big liberalization that greatly decentralized FDI authority down to the locality. So the joint venture rule was lifted, and that led to a big surge in foreign investment into China in this particular strategic industry. Now, this FDI, however, was very much focused on assembly and testing. There was very little R&D content, very little higher value added content in this type of investment. But it served sort of the short-term output maximizing goals of many subnational governments, but did not serve the technology upgrading regime promotion goals of the central government. In fact, the Chinese firms that were located in places that had a lot of strong FDI presence in semiconductors actually found it quite difficult to break into these foreign enclaves. And innovation, as some research has shown, was actually weaker in places with stronger FDI presence. So what happened is that the central government then reasserted control in around 2010 or so on, set up a central investment fund and shifted policies to support Chinese semiconductor firms, such that foreign firms found that they effectively needed to more and more partner with Chinese firms, effectively swinging back to the joint venture model of the 1980s and 1990s, excuse me, to more closely align with the central government's focus on technology upgrading. So in short, globalization ended up weakening rather than strengthening Chinese industrial policy. WTO entry gave subnational governments more resources to bypass central policies that emphasized qualitative upgrading and allowed them instead to pursue quantitative short-term maximization of growth. So globalization ends up supercharging these tensions that have long complicated the central government's relationship with its subnational units. Beijing's high-tech ambitions have in fact been hobbled by the subnational government's very quantitative approach to growth. So to sum up, I hope that the findings that I've presented today allows us to revisit this new conventional wisdom that has coalesced around China's relationship with the global trading system. So rather than asserting that the WTO has failed to alter China's economic model, I've shown that different parts of China's vast state apparatus, in fact, responded very differently to WTO entry. There was a lot of liberalization pushed by the central government, but subnational governments adopted divergent trajectories. To the fears that China has been building a state capitalist model, I argue instead that the turn towards state capitalism was not really the product of a coordinated China incorporated strategy. Rather, it was the product of both domestic and international dynamics. Domestically, we have to think about party-state relations, Externally, we have to think about the strength of WTO leverage that can be used by technocratic agencies to push forward reform. And finally, to the charge that China's state capitalist model is being exported globally through state-owned champions, I suggest that globalization actually has supercharged China's fragmented politics, weakening the overall coherence of industrial policy. So to conclude, while China is an authoritarian one-party system, its engagement with the international economy is far from monolithic, despite single-party rule. Instead, there's active contestation and competing modes of economic governance within China. Rather than constraining the state, WTO entry actually shifted the relative distribution of influence within the state across different sub-state actors, triggering responses that varied across multiple dimensions of China's very complex state structure. So narratives that frame China's WTO experience in terms of simple success or failure not only can't capture these varied internal effects, it also doesn't allow us to learn about why liberalizing reform was stronger in some parts of the state than others, and stronger in some periods than others. So with that, I thank you very much for your patience as I went through the main arguments of the talk. Now I'm looking forward very much to your questions and to your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yeling. This is an excellent, fascinating talk. And I learned a great deal, and I'm going to ask you a few questions afterwards. But before that, let me give the time to my colleague, Zhuang, to give some feedback. And I'll also welcome our audience to raise questions in the Q&A box. John.
Yeah, thank you. As Angela said, this is a fantastic project, and I really like reading the whole book. Actually, I read the book before I came here. So there are several really nice features of this book, and also the theory proposed by this book. So I think the most important one is that it points us back to the reality of China, right? So many people say that China is a one-party state, but basically the theory generally ignore the very complex internal structure of the Chinese government, and also the whole political structure of China. So back to the very early days, Mao Zedong would say that 党外无派，千奇百怪, right? So it's very weird if you think it is really a one-party state and there's no fraction within the party. And also we know that the bureaucratic system does not follow Mao. Is the reason that Mao initiated the Cultural Revolution, which means that there's a strong conflict between the top leader and the bureaucratic system. And also there's strong internal conflict between the different departments within the government. And also, as many political scientists have already pointed out, the central local relationship is also very complicated in China. So I believe that Yeling actually the book is very helpful for us to understand the reality of China and bring us back to the reality, the real government structure of China. And also, this is the first book that studied WTO, especially Chinese government's response to entering the WTO through this lens. So it's very helpful for us to understand Chinese government's policies responding to joining the WTO. And I think the general implication, the book's implication is very general. The finding of the book can also help us to understand some other policies that China adopted in the past several years. For example, let's say China's policy response to the U.S. to the trade war between China and the U.S. Right? We can also understand many things through the lens that Yeling's book proposed. And also, I really find the methodology the book adopts fascinating. So basically, Yeling used a very unique way to capture the key information of regulation in China, which is using machine learning tools to capture the topic, capture the keywords in all a wide range of regulations issued by central and local governments in China, which is a very, very inspired way. And as a law scholar, I would say I'll follow. So in the future, sometime I might follow this approach to see whether we can learn some new information from this approach to understand law and regulation in China, right? So it's not only about economic regulation, we have many types of other regulations. We can all use these tools to study those topics. So these are the things that I find really helpful. And some minor comments and questions for Yeling. So first is that the book pointed out several typologies of strategy or state strategies. So, but I really had a hard time to distinguish developmental strategies and those directive strategies. So some directive strategy, like setting targets, like so you said that those are from the past, commanding central planning economy. But for me, it's also some of these strategies might also like a tool for the state to implement its developmental strategy as well, right? So how do you actually theoretically distinguish these two types of strategy? So this is the first question. Second is that when we look at one of your key findings, which is the provincial developmental strategy, basically the sharp increase of those strategy were from the 2010s rather than from the beginning of China joining the WTO. So I wonder, is it a WTO effect or some other effect, like a financial crisis effect, or the effect of China trying to upgrading its technology? So generally, provincial government are urging, issuing these policies to actually upgrade the industry, right? So it might not attribute the effect to WTO, right? And some technical issue. So I understand you use 北大法宝 PKU law info to collect the data, but 北大法宝, so as I understand the law, so and regulation documents in 北大法宝, so the data there is very few back to the 1990s. And basically 北大法宝 collect tons of regulations after 2010, right? So will the data source influence your results if 北大法宝 is your main source of collecting the legal documents, right? So one final question is about the way you find the latent topic in the data. So you might have different way to do this, right? So you can figure out some keywords like protection of property rights, and simply count how many of these words are there in those legal documents, and you label these kind of legal documents as property protection documents or market enhancing documents or legal documents. But the current way is that you use a unsupervised learning model to find the latent topic. So why do you choose this approach in the first place rather than some other approach? So I think I'll stop here, and this is basically my comment. I really like the book, and I'm looking forward to your response.
Thanks very much for such a careful reading of the book, and for your comments, John. This is really, I really appreciate your thoughts and your comments. So I guess I'll just respond in the order of the questions that you raised. So firstly, in terms of the three-stage strategies and how to distinguish and practice developmental strategies versus directive. So I agree with you in the sense that the typology I proposed is in stylized terms, and in practice, you know, it's much more of a spectrum. In part, that's why the machine learning methodology that I use allows for a given policy to have a mixture of strategies. So a given policy could be, for example, 60% or majority developmental, but have still some directive content in it, like 10% directive content, because policies are not so quote unquote pure, you know, in practice. But another way to think about distinguishing between the two, so that was sort of more of a methodological answer to your question. Theoretically, I would say, well, one way to distinguish between these two strategies is to look at it from the point of view of the firm, right? Which is responding to changes in their business environment due to these policies. So a directive policy gives a firm very little room to respond, right? A directive policy will say, in stylized terms, produce 80 sewing machines by tomorrow, or produce 80 new energy vehicles by the end of this month. Whereas a developmental strategy does give the firm some room to respond, right? The firm is responding to these incentives. It's saying, well, I actually want to invest in new energy vehicles because there's a lot of state support for me. So I'm lured to this sector rather than I'm told I have to go, and produce this type of product versus another. So that's, I think, both the theoretical way of distinguishing, but also methodologically how I distinguish between the two. And you're very astute in noticing that there's the biggest surge in developmental policies from the province level was in 2010. And indeed, that is undoubtedly due to the financial crisis. So how I deal with that in the statistical analysis is basically, rather than just relying on the visual trend that I showed in the talk, statistically, I did two things, right? So first is to capture how much of the change in language came from the WTO. So to proxy for that, I used tariff cuts for each industry. So what was the tariff cut for each industry that China committed to in its protocol of accession? I used that tariff cut to say, in response to the tariff cut, right, how much did policy language change? So that allows me to say, well, this is coming from a trade-related policy measure rather than the financial crisis. The other thing that I did statistically was basically to put in, and forgive me for getting technical, but basically to put in a year fixed effects, and that controls for any event that happens in a single year, such as a financial crisis that affects the economy writ large. So that absorbs the effects of it absorbs any reactions that's coming from the financial crisis, that allows us to then hone in and to identify what's happening as a result of just the WTO tariff cuts. So that's how I deal with the fact that there is undoubtedly reactions occurring to the financial crisis, as we see from the visual trends. Statistically, I do everything that I can to control for that, but also, again, by using the tariff cuts to try to identify changes that are resulting from those tariff cuts rather than other types of events that are equally important but happening at a different point in time. And then thirdly, I think that's also a very important methodological point, which is the beta fabao that I used. There are indeed fewer policies available to collect from the 1990s. I should say, by the way, that you're saying that as a legal scholar, you might want to use some of these methods as well in your scholarly inquiry. I should reveal that my inspiration for going down this methodological road actually came from reading a number of legal reports that use this database in very creative ways, and that kind of sparked my imagination to try and apply this to political science. So it's really a process of mutual learning, as it turns out, that is occurring here. Again, some of the statistical methods that I use will try to control for the fact that in certain periods of time, there might be fewer policies available to collect. But that's undeniably a shortcoming of the overall corpus that was collected. And then finally, in terms of looking for latent topics, right? Yeah, there are a variety of ways in which we could go about labeling and finding these topics. And there's a wide variety of tools out there. Some which I use are entirely unsupervised. Some are semi-supervised. So you have coders, just seed a few keywords and then you layer on machine learning. And then a third method is entirely supervised. So you just use, you could get a group of experts together, they come up with the keywords, they come up with the topics, and you just sort of, in a sense, manually generate the topics based on expert knowledge. The reason I went down the unsupervised route is because when I developed my typology, right, I don't have very strong priors of what exact words would constitute a directive language, right? Or what exact words would constitute regulatory language, what exact words would be developmental. So I prefer to just let the algorithm kind of reveal how the words are clustering naturally, which words are co-occurring, and then dive into the documents to say, well, okay, what's going on behind this topic? Does it look more regulatory or does it look more developmental? If I were coming at it from a legal perspective where I have a set of key words that very much cohere to one particular legal concept, right? Then I might imagine not using an unsupervised topic modeling, but using either semi-supervised or completely supervised, because the experts already know, right? You already know what words are likely to be in a topic. So there's no point using unsupervised. So I chose this because it kind of matched up to the fact that I was coming at it from a more open perspective. But thank you very much for the questions.
Thank you, Yeling. Yeah, I really enjoyed your book as well. But one question I have as a legal scholar, when I see that you use a massive amount of database of regulations to do this analysis, is whether you take into account, the constraints that each of these three levels of actors face when they adopt regulations. So, for instance, China promulgated the law of legislation in 2000. So this is like a law that kind of set out the hierarchy, like and the constraints for each level of the actors in promulgating legislation, right? So the most important laws that concerns like human rights and financial interests, these are left in the discretion of the top level, like the central government, right? So for instance, tax matters, right, are explicitly left for the state and local governments, unless with particular authorization, that are not allowed to legislate in the round of tax, right? So that might affect, because of these constraints on each level of these actors, might affect endogenously how they, the type of law that they will specialize in. Local government at the lowest level, they just have very little, discretion and very small scope to promulgate and adopt legislations. And I wonder whether you take into account these issues when you conduct the study.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And in a sense, it reminds me of how much I have to learn from the legal community, especially when I was doing this research on the WTO. Part of me really wanted to just go back to law school and learn in particular about international trade law, because it's so technical. I think when it comes to industrial policies more broadly, that constraint is a little bit more relaxed, because many of the industrial policies are so broad, right? Like the 5-year plans and so on. And the implementing policies, you still are relying on local governments to flesh out the implementing policies. So what I collected are a lot of those implementing policies. So I think for my particular topic of interest, it might be slightly less of a concern. If I were to really dive into, say, human rights law, right, then we would have to bring in those constraints much in a much more rigorous way. But that's a really good point.
Well, thank you, Yeling. We are running out of time almost, and we have a one quick audience question that would like you to clarify a bit about the competing modes of governance in China as you're talking at the conclusion. Would you be able to give a very quick answer to that question?
Sure. Yeah, those competing modes of governance basically refer to, in a sense, what John and I were discussing earlier. So I lay out 3 different types of competing modes of governance. So a directive mode, which is more central planning, a developmental mode, which is more about giving firms incentives to go into high-tech sectors, and a regulatory mode that's more about building market enhancing regulatory institutions. Those are the 3 competing modes.
Right, excellent. Okay, that's actually, we're exactly ending it on time. And I personally learned a great deal from reading your work, not just the book, but also your other writings. So I'm a big fan of your work, Yeling, and I'm so glad that you can come and present at our workshop. And I also thank John for spending time reading the entire book and provide very insightful feedback, and thank all the audience for joining us. So thank you all, and see you next time.
Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you, John, and thank you, everyone. It's been a real pleasure and such an honor to be part of your series.
Thank you.